Hey guys, welcome to the first episode of the Pessimist Guide to Cincinnati Sports. Um, if you know me and you follow me on Twitter, then you'll get the reference on that. Hope everybody is having a good evening. Hope everybody is making it through these somewhat difficult times for fans of the Cincinnati teams of all sports. The Bengals are struggling. The Reds season is over and they missed the playoffs. The University of Cincinnati football team is not not doing well. Um, so we've not had it easy in Cincinnati. I'm going to be doing this show weekly. That will be Wednesday, tentatively every Wednesday at 8 p.m. If there's a change in that, I will give you notice. I want to go ahead and jump right in because we've got some things that I want to get to this evening. I appreciate you watching. You can follow me at Vance Meek. It will be on your screen right in the lower left-hand corner. You can go follow me there. If you're not already following me, be sure to follow the Around the Block Network as well. I appreciate those guys letting me come back and do another show. You may be familiar with some of the shows that I've done in the past with them. So let's jump right in. The Cincinnati Bengals, and this is not my favorite topic. I should have done this show last week after the win, and it would be a little happier. Obviously, this week coming off a brutal loss to the Tennessee Titans, who really aren't that good of a team. They had just gotten blown out the week before. They sit at 1-3 now, and the season is really on the brink. It's not looking good for the home team now. Obviously, if you're a fan and have been a fan for more than just a few years, you know that there were some dark times in Cincinnati. The team wasn't good for a long time. And then Joe Burrow came along and has elevated the team to what is supposed to be a Super Bowl contender on a regular basis. They went to the Super Bowl 2 years ago. They just missed the Super Bowl last year, and they were one of the favorites going into this season. And then back in late July, early August, Joe Burrow injured his calf, and things kind of went downhill from there. The timeline was several weeks, as Zach Taylor said, that bled into the regular season. He was deemed healthy enough to start, and he did. They didn't play well at week one, got blown out by Cleveland, and then in week two he sort of re-injured the calf, and it really hasn't gotten a lot better since then. Um, the the problems on the team are numerous. If you watch the team and you have watched this team, then you know that last year and this year couldn't be more different as far as execution, and that's on both sides of the ball. Um, through 4 games so far, the Bengals have scored a grand total of 3 offensive touchdowns, 4 touchdowns total. That's counting the Charlie Jones punt return touchdown. The offense just has not been able to get going at all. They have struggled in the red zone. Even when they have gotten down there, they've settled for field goals. They opened the game up with Tennessee with a nice drive, got down to the I think around the 5 or 6 yard line on third down, ran the ball, got it to the 2, decided to settle for the field goal, and never scored again. The offense, and we're going to get into some of the reasons that may be for that momentarily. But just a few numbers that I want to throw out. Obviously, as I said, 3 offensive touchdowns so far through 4 games. That's just that's not going to win. That's not going to win football games. It's a miracle that they're 1-3 instead of 0-4. Their defense has, and you can blame that on the offense. The defense has had to stay on the field for very long periods of time. But right now, the run defense is ranked 31st in the league. Some of that is because the opponents are getting out to early leads and they're just pounding the ball for the whole game. But nonetheless, they rank 31st in the league in run defense. They're somewhere middle of the pack in pass defense. So they haven't been exactly great there either. But the pass defense and run defense are balanced the way they are, partly because of the fact that the Bengals are down almost always. On the offensive side of the ball, they're only averaging 12.3 points per game, which is 31st in the league. They're not scoring. As I said, they've got 3 touchdowns on offense plus the 1 punt return touchdown. Meanwhile, they're giving up 23.5 points a game, which is near the bottom of the league, I believe. I didn't make a note of where that ranked, but They have given up obviously almost double the number of runs that are of touchdowns that they've scored, and you're just not going to win games like that. As I said, it's a miracle they're not 0-4. Passing in particular has been really the Achilles heel. They are 29th in the league in passing yards per game, and really it could be worse. They've had a couple of nice runs. They had the good game versus the Rams. The end of the Ravens game, maybe in the second half, was a little better, and they were able to get the ball moving some. But other than that, the ball just has not been the pass game has not been a part of what the Cincinnati Bengals have been able to do. They have not been effective running the ball as well. They rank 31st in rushing per game, but that's something that we're going to get into as some of the reasons why this season has gone downhill. But the first reason, right off the top, is obviously the Joe Burrow injury. If you watch Joe Burrow play, and if you watched any of these 4 games that he's played so far, it's very easy to see that he is not healthy and may not be really even close to 100%. He is. The Bengals are running a quick passing game to protect him as much as they can. They tried to actually have a little bit more of a drop back game and down the field game against the Titans, and it didn't work. The Titans started bringing pressure. They started blitzing every other play, especially every passing down, and they were just getting to Burrow. He's not able to move. Part of what's made Burrow great over the time that he's been in the NFL is his ability to make guys miss that are coming on as a pass rush and getting out, rolling out, extending plays, throwing off platform, and making plays down the field, finding those receivers and scoring points off of that. And right now, he just can't move. He is dropping back and is having to stand basically completely still. Yes, he scrambled for a first down early on, probably a designed run, actually. But it was only like 3 yards, and he slid immediately, almost too soon. But it's easy to see. He is not healthy. He's not really all that close to healthy. You could make an argument that he really shouldn't be out there. However, what do you have behind him? We as fans, a lot of us wanted the Bengals to get a better starting or a backup quarterback, and they chose not to do so. Jake Browning, and we haven't seen him play, so I don't want to say that he's going to be awful, but he was a undrafted prospect on my list when he came out, and hasn't really shown a lot in preseason and stuff that he would be really much better than an injured Burrow. And they don't have anybody behind him really worth talking about. They recently signed AJ McCarron, but he hasn't played in quite a while other than XFL. So that's really not an option. Burrow is clearly going to play. Zach Taylor said as much, and they'll kind of monitor it, hope he doesn't injure it worse. And in theory, it'll get better and better as time goes on. The question is going to be, is it going to be too late? Are the Bengals going to be too far out of the playoff race by the time that he is healthy enough to start being the Burrow that we've kind of grown to love all this time? The next thing that we as fans have talked about a lot, and I've been talking about for multiple years at this point, even during the Super Bowl run and last year's run to the AFC Championship game, and that's Zach Taylor and the play calling, and you can throw Brian Callahan obviously in there as well. The offense has enough talent between Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd. They have had in the past. This year, obviously, they've had some tight end problems, but they've had some solid tight ends in the past that fit what they do and worked out fairly well. Excuse me. But this is an offense with enough talent, and Joe Mixon, I don't think I mentioned him, should be averaging 25 to 30 points a game. Should be a top 5 offense in the NFL. There's no real valid reason why it's not. However, it hasn't hit that plateau yet. They were, I believe, top 10 both of the last 2 years, but not top 5. And this is an offense that should be up in that upper tier elite offensive range as far as offenses around the league. The difference seems to be not a talent difference, because as we've talked about ad nauseum, the Bengals have one of the top couple of best wide receivers units in the entire league. The issue seems to be the ability to scheme those guys open. If you go look at the Miami Dolphins and what they are doing, especially this year, they just put up 70 points in a game. And despite the fact that they lost this past weekend to the Bills, they still managed to put some points on the board. And then teams like the 49ers, even some of the teams that have lost, they're still scoring points, and the Bengals haven't figured that out. And if you're going to play with an injured quarterback, then your offensive play calling group has to be able to figure out how to be successful with that injured quarterback. And thus far, they have not been able to do that. It's been bubble screen, slant, quick out, a few intermediate throws here and there, but not many, and no downfield game at all. And you're just not going to be successful that way. They also have gotten away from the run, and this is something that we've talked about, a lot of us on Twitter. The run game has been fairly effective this year. Joe Mixon, I've commented multiple times, has looked like young Joe Mixon. I know he's not really old, but younger Joe Mixon. He's shiftier this year. He looks like he's making guys miss. He's also breaking tackles and running hard. He looks like a new man, much better than he did last year. Unfortunately, they seem to use him early, and then they gradually get away from that. And I don't know if that is some of it. Obviously, is later in games when they're losing by 3 scores, you can't run the ball. But they have gotten away from that even in games that were closer, and they've relied on Joe Burrow to try to create magic, and he hasn't been able to do so. There's a general lack of creativity that has always been there with the Bengals offense and around Zach Taylor, and that's one of the reasons that I just haven't been a fan. He doesn't seem to have a really creative mind, and maybe you can put a lot of the blame on Brian Callahan. But between the two of them, they have not always had the most creative game plans. They haven't always gone for the throat, even when last year and the year before, when they were one of the top teams, they would not really always put teams away as they could have and should have, and allowed teams to come back, allowed teams to stay in games, and it has hurt them a few times over the past few years. One of the things that I think that Bengals fans need to talk about more and need to be aware of, and at least consider before when you're talking about Zach Taylor and Brian Callahan in the offense, is the third part of that, and that's Joe Burrow. He's going to have say on the offense, on audibles, on the scheme, and there have been some talk from fans, from media. And recently, Brian Callahan, I believe it was, in an interview, kind of intimated that Burrow doesn't necessarily like some of the things that seem to make offenses successful in 2023, and that is things like using motion. That in the interview that I was speaking of with Callahan, he kind of hinted, he didn't say outright, but he kind of hinted that Joe Burrow doesn't really like the motion as much. He prefers to have the receiver static. You spread out 5 wide and you keep them static so he can read the defense. But that also makes it easier on defenses to know where you're at, and you're not going to be able to really fool them with a lot. You're asking your receivers to just go out and beat their man, and they can do that, especially Jamar Chase can do that at times. But that allows them to set their defense, keep the 2 high safeties back if they, depending on what you've lined up with, and it's going to make it harder on the offense. You're putting an artificial cap on the offense by not using the things that have made other offenses successful, using the motion to confuse the defense and to keep them from seeing where you're going to be lined up at. We've seen them be successful this year when they have ran motion. T. Higgins had a nice play, running out of motion just this past week. Wasn't a huge game, but it was a first down. I believe he gained on the play, maybe 13, 14 yards. We saw in the Rams game, one of the few big plays they've had this year was on motion, and they were able to hit Jamar Chase down the field. It was a really nicely designed play. Um, we've heard that Burrow doesn't really like to turn his back to the defense, use the play action, run plays under center, and maybe there's I don't whether it's Burrow or the team doesn't really find tight ends to be useful, doesn't like the 12 personnel or some of those nuances, and those are things that good teams do. And if Burrow is a part of that and is holding on to the style that he is currently working with, then I think that they need to sit Joe Burrow down, and I think that's an issue going forward. They need to, if that's the case, then Joe Burrow is artificially capping his own success. Like you're turning a top 3 offense into a 7th or 8th ranked offense. You're costing yourself, even if it's just 3, 4, 5 points a game, that can be the difference between a Super Bowl and a trip to the house for the playoffs. So I think there's some things that that the Bengals, obviously going forward this year, it's going to take a massive run. They did it last year. That was very hard to do. I know a lot of fans are talking about, they won 11 straight last year, or 10 of 11, or whatever it was. You can't do that. You can't count on that every year. You can't come out, start seasons slow, 1-3, 0-2, 2-4, whatever the case may be, and then expect to make a long run and get into the playoffs, especially in the AFC these days. You've got so many good quarterbacks and good teams. The Dolphins and Bills both look amazing. The Chiefs are still there. The Ravens have looked fantastic this year. The Browns are improved, at least. The Chargers should be good if they can get out of their own way. And then whoever, the AFC South, who knows? But they do have Trevor Lawrence. So artificially capping your own offense is just, it's not wise to me. And I think that if we're going to go forward and we're going to allow criticism for Zach Taylor and Brian Callahan, then you have to allow criticism if Joe Burrow is capping his own offense by not wanting to do the things that can make this offense go from really good to elite. The Cincinnati Reds, I want to jump over and here we go. We're shifting into Reds mode, and a little bit happier. I know the Reds didn't make the playoffs. They sort of had a second half swoon, if we want to call it that. We've seen that in the past from the Reds, and it's disappointing. They have had time at first place. After the All-Star break, they came out and got wrecked by the Milwaukee Brewers, and then took some tough losses later in September to the Cardinals, to the Pirates, and a few others games that maybe they should have won and they couldn't hold on to, and maybe that cost them in the end. But it's important to note that overall, this was a successful season. The Reds were expected to be terrible. If you go back to the beginning of the season, and especially if you go back and look at the lineup that the Reds started with this season, Votto was hurt. They had India and Jonathan India, Tyler Stevenson, and then a bunch of guys that you may have never heard of. And they weren't doing well. They were relying a lot on their young pitchers. It didn't take very long for that plan to start kind of going down the drain as Nick Lodolo got hurt early on. Graham Ashcraft, a few starts in, began to struggle and went through a period where he really was terrible. Hunter Green got hurt a few months into the season, and they wound up relying on pitchers that they hadn't planned on relying on, and they weren't very good. They were winning a few games here and there, but by the time the Reds got to early June, they were still losing. They were 29-35 on June the 9th. And we're in, I believe it was 4th place in the division at the time, and we're really an afterthought. They weren't really doing a lot. And that's when they went on the 12-game winning streak. They got over 500 and never looked back. They finished the season over 500. But it was if you look at the big picture, the reason this season was good And I know I was asked, how was this a good season because the Reds missed the playoffs and they choked and they didn't, um, didn't finish the season like we all would have liked them to, and I'm sure they would have liked to. But there's a lot of promise and a lot to look forward to with this team and the way that they pulled together and the way that they fought back from looking bad early in the season to almost making the playoffs and a winning record with a team that had no right to have a winning record. Going back to mid-May, while they were struggling and were fourth, fifth place in the division, the Pirates were actually still good at that time. The Reds started to call up some of the young players, which is what you do. You're not a good team. Let's get our young players up that are the next guys to come to the majors, and let's get them some at-bats against Major League pitching. First guy up was Matt McLain. Matt McLain stepped in and immediately showed why he was such a highly thought of young player. Hit the ball as well as it's possible to hit. He was one of the best pure hitters in the league. A lot of line drives to gaps. Showed some pop as well. Hit some home runs. Seemed to have some clutch hits and was energy and was immediately a factor in the Reds lineup. Obviously got hurt the last month of the season and missed. Maybe could have helped. Maybe would have made a difference in some of those games they lost that kept them out of the playoffs. But in the end, he ended up hitting 290, had an 864 OPS. Pretty fabulous rookie year. If he had played the whole season, you got to think he would be right in the thick of things for Rookie of the Year. Early June, they called up Elly De La Cruz. Elly De La Cruz's season was interesting to say the least. He started off with a bang, hit a massive home run, and I believe it was the second game. Had a cycle game against the Braves. Stole home. Stole 35 bases for the year, which is pretty remarkable considering that he only had a 300 on base percentage. If he had even had, a 350, 375 on base percentage, you're looking at probably, and had played the whole year, you're probably looking at, 60 to 70 stolen bases. He seemed to be figuring out some of the hitting later in the season. I think that's important to note. I was as hard on Elly De La Cruz's propensity to strike out as anybody. But towards the end of the year, the last 2 to 3 weeks, he began to correct some of the issues that were causing him to strike out. His chase rate, I don't know it off the top of my head. I didn't look it up, but it had to drop. There had to be quite a big difference between his chase rate over the last 2 to 3 weeks as opposed to the August and early September numbers. He started to walk more. He started to take pitches and allow pitchers to force them to make to make good pitches. Now he still missed them. He still has a little bit of a hole in his swing that he needs to correct. But as far as his eye at the plate, it improved quite a bit, and I think that is some reason to look forward to what he can do. We obviously know there's potential to be a mega star in Major League Baseball, but I think there's enough evidence that going forward, he will be better next year. Moved ahead to mid-July, and they called up Christian Encarnacion Strand. Now, a lot of people thought he should have made the opening day roster, including me. But they called him up, he stayed in the minors to work on his chase rate as well. And once they brought him up, he flashed his power here and there. But as the at-bats kind of stacked up and he got some more time, you were able to see him become more of a professional hitter. He started smacking the ball the other way and letting the sliders out of the zone go. And then by the end of the season, he was flashing the 40 home run power potential that he has. Ended up hitting homers in 7 of his last 12 games. Ended the season with, I think, 13 total home runs and about a 270 batting average. Was pretty fantastic down the stretch. And should only get better as well. You're talking about a guy, like I said, that could hit 40, 45 home runs in a full season, especially as he moves along and gets more experience. And then the final guy that I want to mention of the rookies, Noelvi Marte, might be the best of all of them. certainly was the kind of the bell cow in many ways of the offense coming down the stretch, and certainly wasn't responsible for them not making the playoffs. Ended the season on a 16-game hit streak. Finished up with a 316 batting average and a OPS over 800. Flashed his power. Played a Gold Glove caliber third baseman. It's easy to see that this guy could win some Gold Gloves in his career. Made a lot of good plays and was generally brought even more excitement. He's also really young. He and Ellie De La Cruz both very young and should only get better. And that's pretty terrifying to imagine with the way he played at the end of the season as it is. Andrew Abbott is obviously not a hitter. Another guy that they called him up in early June, and he immediately set it out and was one of the better pitchers in all of baseball for the first few months. Was 4-0 at one point. I think he was maybe 8-3 even at one point. He struggled down the stretch. Arm got tired. You could see that he was exhausted by the end of the season. His location of his pitches was starting to go bad, and he gave up some home runs, gave up a lot of hits. Despite that, and despite the way the season ended, when he had some pretty terrible outings at the end of the season, he still ended with an ERA under 4. Is another guy that is going to fit into this rotation going forward and looks like he's going to be a really good one, along with Hunter Green, Nick Lodolo, Graham Ashcraft, and then Brandon Williamson or Connor Phillips or whoever rounds out the rotation. And I mentioned those guys. I didn't even mention Spencer Steer, another rookie who had a professional season. Like, he did not look like a rookie at all. Led the team in several offensive categories. Was a big part of why they were able to win 12 straight and why they were able to stay in the playoff race all along. Also played defense really well at multiple positions. They had him at third base. He played first base. He played second base for a bit. Played left field for them and did all of those things better than I thought he would, especially left field. I thought he might struggle in the outfield, but he made several really nice plays and should only get better as well at that. Will Benson, the other guy that I wanted to mention as well. Technically, I don't think a rookie. You guys can correct me on that. At the beginning of the season, and up until he was sent down, he couldn't hit. He was hitting, I believe, at one point under 100. He was terrible. They sent him down. He came back up, and you wouldn't think it was the same player. He was absolutely electric. He was stealing bases. He was knocking guys in with triples. He was hitting home runs, and was just generally an exciting player, and certainly a big cog as well in the success of the team this year. Obviously, for me, the MVP of the team this year, and you could argue Spencer Steer was that guy. TJ Friedl, one of my favorite all-time Reds, maybe at this point. I remember, I believe it was last year, they didn't even make the opening day roster, even though I thought he should. This year, man, he did literally everything for this team. He carried them on his back at times. He was sometimes the only player that was able to hit. He was exciting. He was fired up and a leader on his team. He stole bases. He hit triples. He hit doubles. He hit home runs. I don't know how many he ended up with exactly, but I believe it was over 15. And he's not a big guy. He played a Gold Glove caliber defense in center field. He robbed home runs. He made diving catches. Like, this dude was everything for this team, and I hope he continues it into next year and beyond. I hope he stays a Red for a long time, and he's going to go down as one of my favorite all-time Reds. As to what went wrong, we can talk about that everything was a great year. There was a lot of positives going into 2024. Obviously, injuries was a large part of the downfall of the Cincinnati Reds this year. As I mentioned, Joey Votto missed a bunch of time at the beginning of the season. He was injured. Nick Lodolo went down and basically missed the whole year. Hunter Green missed a large chunk of action in the middle of the season with an injury. Graham Ashcraft was hurt and missed, and he was really good to start the season. Then he struggled. but he came on and was an absolutely dominant pitcher in the second half of the season before he got hurt. But he missed the last or approximately a month or so. So his absence hurt. Jonathan India missed some time. Matt McClain missed the last little over a month of the season. Jake Fraley missed some time. And these are all important players. These aren't bench guys. These are, guys who start and were a big part of what this team's identity was. And they were absent. There were other smaller injuries. A bout of COVID ran through the pitching staff in late August, I believe. And several guys had to miss at least a start or a couple starts, or some bullpen guys were sick and not able to go out. So some of that's bad luck. You can't help it. You can't control when people get hurt or get sick, and it's unfortunate. And maybe if they have all those guys healthy, or at least a majority of the time, then maybe they squeeze into the playoffs. They didn't miss it by a lot. A couple of games here and there may have made the difference. The bullpen, and I think we'll probably in a future episode maybe go into the bullpen a little farther. There's a couple of guests that I'd like to have on to discuss the Reds in particular. But the bullpen, if you talk to fans, they're going to point out, and you can look at numbers, the bullpen was improved. They, guys like Buck Farmer and Ian Jabot put up pretty good numbers. But overall, by the end of the season, they were absolutely gassed. The league leaders in outings from bullpen guys, the Reds had a bunch of them. It was not. And again, we talked about the injuries to their starters. That leaves you with guys that aren't able to go 6 and 7 innings for the most part. Luke Weaver was consistently done by the third or fourth inning. They were having to use bullpen days and start Fernando Cruz here, or some of the other guys here and there, and then that takes a toll. By the end of the season, their bullpen guys, you could just tell, weren't themselves. Alexis Diaz was a primary example of that. He had a terrible second half of the season, and particularly the last week or two of the season, he was giving up bombs left and right. Couldn't hold innings. Couldn't make saves. The 9-0 game that they blew, they tried to use him to help that out. He gave up, I think, 5 of the runs of his own. He was exhausted, and the entire bullpen was. So, while I'm not a big fan of a lot of the bullpen guys, and we'll talk about that later on, they were not helped by the injury situation and the amount of stress that was put on them, and how many outings they had to have, and the usage on their arms. The other elephant in the room, so to speak, is David Bell. I think that I would guess a lot of maybe a majority even of Reds fans aren't big David Bell fans. Yes, the team this year performed above expectation, but there were many games where it seemed like David Bell just made some odd decisions that didn't work out. Bringing in the guys that it was almost like he didn't know his own players' strengths and weaknesses. So he would bring in Ian Jabot with bases loaded and nobody out, and that's just not his strength. Or he would bring in Sims at the wrong time. It just seemed like a lot of those bullpen decisions, especially, didn't work out. He also had a weird habit of leaving guys like Kevin Newman or Nick Senzel in the game, even after the other team went to a right-handed pitcher. And those guys can't hit right-handed pitchers. Newman especially was bad, I believe. But he would stick with those guys, and then they would, it would cost the Reds later on. They'd get men on base and one or two, maybe one out, man on second, and Newman would come in, strike out versus a right-handed hitter that he shouldn't, a right-handed pitcher he shouldn't be facing in the first place. He would bring, I remember when he tried to pitch Alexis Diaz 2 innings, and that didn't work out. So managerially and roster management wise, it feels to me like he doesn't really have a good feel for how to manage that kind of thing. Like, he doesn't have great instincts for that. He uses the analytics a lot, which is fine and has its place, but you either have to be analytically driven or not. And he seemed to follow that at times, and then randomly would not. And when he did not, it didn't work out a lot of the time. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how I feel about him going forward. Obviously, he got an extension this year. He's not going anywhere. We can talk about how bad he is or how bad we think he is as much as we like, but he's not going anywhere for the foreseeable future anyway. But I have some questions about his ability to successfully manage a team. This is the second team that he had that was in a playoff race that collapsed in the second half, if you want to use the word collapse. But we'll see. We'll see how next year goes. They all right, should be a good team next year. Should be back in the thick of things, assuming everybody comes in healthy and plays up to the quality of play that they've established that they can this year. But I want to end on a positive note. So the Reds in particular, I think, have a really bright future going into 2024. You got to figure a World Series window is officially open at this point, anywhere between 2024, 2026, 27. We'll see what happens when these guys' contracts start coming due, because you're talking about McLean, De La Cruz, Encarnacion Strand, Marte. They're all going to be deserve big paydays. Some of the pitching staff, they've already paid Hunter Green. These guys are going to warrant being paid big money. And we'll see what happens when that comes along. They do have a deep minor league system. That's another episode that I want to have, another conversation that I want to have with a guest or two who follow those minor leaguers more closely than I do. But if you're a Reds fan, there's a reason to be happy despite how the season ended. If you're a Bengals fan, there's always hope. They did go on a run last year. It's going to hinge on Joe Burrow. And I don't know that he's going to be healthy in time to save the season this year. But hope springs eternal, and I think that they've certainly got the talent. We'll see what happens if things continue to get worse. There'll be questions: do you trade T. Higgins or any of the other guys? What changes do you make next offseason if you don't trade T. Higgins? Do you pay T. Higgins next year? Do you spend that much money on your receivers? Is this Tyler Boyd's last season? What happens with the offensive line if they don't improve going forward? Do you make some replacements? That's another conversation that I do want to have a future episode. As far as the drafting, the Bengals obviously haven't been good at drafting offensive linemen, so there's a lot to look forward to. This is, despite the 1-3 record for the Bengals, despite the close of the season and the Reds missing the playoffs, this is a good sports town to be a fan of in 2023 and going forward. And I think that's what we need to remember. Sure, be mad, be disappointed in how things are playing out right now. But even though I am a pessimist, there is plenty of optimism to be had at this current moment in time. I appreciate you guys tuning in, and any who tune in and watch later on. And I hope you join me next time, and we'll talk more Reds, Bengals, and maybe we'll squeeze in some University of Cincinnati football. Hopefully they play a little better next Saturday. See you guys later.